Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 60 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, here it is, the first Camera Position episode of 2008, and I thought it would be time to get back to basics. I've had a couple of listeners ask me about this particular topic, so I'm going to go ahead and do a podcast here about basic photographic composition. For some of you, this might be a bit of a review, but hopefully you'll get a little bit of idea about composition out of today's podcast episode. Now, I also want to remind everybody that Camera Position is an enhanced podcast, and that, of course, means that the visuals are recorded along with the audio, so you can either listen to and watch Camera Position right there on the cameraposition.com blog page, and you can see the video play right there in the blog page, and I know that some of you are doing that. Or you can use that same blog page to simply download Camera Position and play Camera Position in either the iTunes player or the QuickTime player. And either one of those, what you can do is expand the window so that you can see the slides that I'm using somewhat bigger, and you can even expand it all the way up to about 1024 by 768 pixels, so you can really see the details in what it is that I'm talking about. For those of you who are subscribing through iTunes, and I know there are a lot of you doing that, again, if you just open the window, or you can do a couple of things. Either you can scroll sort of the iTunes interface so that little window in the lower left corner is quite a bit bigger, or alternately, you can just click on it, double-click on it, and it will open the visual window up in a much larger window so that you can drag it to the size that you want. So, okay, now that we've gotten those sort of technical things out of the way, let's just jump into composition. Now, I've always sort of believed that one of the basic ideas about composition is that looking at the work of master photographers is an important part of learning composition, because these men and women have been out there doing these things and have solved a lot of those visual problems for us. So to that end, I've started out here with this fabulous and lyrical Edward Weston head-down nude image that I'll just sort of use as an introduction to the idea of great composition and how great composition leads our eye around the frame. So what I thought I would do is start talking about the basic rules of composition, and we'll see if we can kind of cover those, both just sort of scrolling through them here and then using some examples, some visual examples of compositional rules. One is simplify. Simplify. Get the picture to be as simple as you can make it. That in and of itself will help your compositions be a lot more efficient. Another one, the rule of thirds, laying a sort of tic-tac-toe grid over the image can really help get the image to do what you want it to do by giving you some hints about the way in which you can compose your photographs. Using leading lines to help guide the viewer's eye through the composition, either from foreground to background or from left to right or right to left, top to bottom, etc. Using leading lines is another one of those rules of composition. Thinking about balance is another part. Thinking about the balance, whether it's symmetrically balanced or asymmetrically balanced, how your photograph is balanced left to right, top to bottom. Using framing, and not necessarily the framing of placing the elements inside of the image frame, your camera's frame, but rather framing elements within the photograph, and we'll take a look at a few of those examples as well. Avoiding mergers that amazingly unpleasant experience that happens when we forget that the two-dimensional photograph is representing a three-dimensional world. But I'm also going to talk about how a lot of great photographers have used mergers to great effect. So we'll talk about mergers and how to avoid them if we don't want them, but also how to use them if we do. Rules of composition, the next one, getting close to our subject so that we can really see what it is that the subject has to offer. Really, I guess, analogous to simplifying, but oftentimes very different in that getting in close really helps us to see the subject of the photograph and eliminate some of that extraneous material. Another aspect of this is that those little bits and pieces of rules of composition are really, I think, more guidelines than they are rules. They're really not so much rules as they are just sort of indicators of things that might help you make better looking photographs. So one of the things that I've always advocated is learn those rules of composition and then just plain forget them. Forget that they ever existed and get rid of them out of your head and break them even if you want to, because rules are meant to be broken, right? So let's just sort of get on with it and see if we can find out what it is that the rules of composition do for us. Here is a great photograph by Barbara Morgan, a photograph of the great modern dancer Martha Graham dancing her dance Letter to the World, and the photograph is called Letter to the World Kick. And here, Barbara Morgan, the photographer, has dramatically simplified the image, leaving only the dancer in the frame, and obviously chosen a really wonderful moment of heightened excitement, visual excitement, as the dancer kicks her dress up. But also take a look at how that simplification really has some interesting aspects to it. The line that Martha Graham's body creates, the sort of horizontal line with her hand at the top of her head, and look at how that lines up with the horizon line in the back of the theater, whether it's a theater or a set or whatever it is that Barbara Morgan was photographing Graham on. I don't think that that's necessarily just luck of the draw. I think Morgan was really cleverly thinking about where to place her camera, high or low. And I know for a fact that Morgan sort of made the dancers, when she made these photographs of modern dancers, she'd make them go through the routine a number of times so that she could get that moment that she wanted. So here it is that she's done that and really lined up her camera and eliminated all the extraneous material from the image. By simplifying, the photograph has made a really beautiful and quite lyrical image. The rule of thirds. Now, I've noticed in the digital camera realm that a number of digital cameras now are coming with these rule of thirds guidelines sort of superimposed on the LCD viewfinder, which I find to be really pretty interesting. Certainly one of the problems that photographers have always had, or have had for quite a long time, is that many cameras have a sort of bullseye focusing ring in the very center of the frame. And of course, that's one of the least interesting places to put your subject in a sort of a general way. So the rule of thirds, and here we're looking at Dorothea Lange's great FSA, Farm Security Administration photograph, Tractored Out. The rule of thirds says that what we can do is we can place a grid, a sort of a tic-tac-toe grid, over the photographic scene, and in those intersections of lines, where those lines intersect, is generally considered a great place to put a subject or a thing of interest in your photograph. But furthermore, take a look at the horizontal lines and the vertical lines. Those can be really interesting places to place either a horizon line or a vertical element in your photograph. So here in Lange's Tractored Out, what we get is the photograph really having that house right exactly at one of those rule of thirds spots, having the horizon line right exactly at one of those rule of thirds horizontal lines, really emphasizing the structure of the photographic image and the way in which Lange has put it together. If we take that basic idea of the rule of thirds and we lay it over a couple of other photographs, here we've got an Henri Cartier-Bresson photograph and an André Kertész photograph. And if we take a look at those two images and we look at them with that same tic-tac-toe-like grid placed over the image, we can see places in which the two photographers have used that rule of thirds concept and used it pretty effectively to place elements of interest both at those intersections of those lines, but also vertical and horizontal elements in places that are on or very near those vertical lines or the horizontal lines, and it seems to work out pretty well. And if you begin to lay this out over some of your photographs and begin to take a look at how you have composed images, and even if you kind of just mentally draw these lines in your camera, if you don't have one of these newfangled cameras that have the superimposed tic-tac-toe lines on the viewfinder, and of course view camera photographers, of which I am one, we've often had those grids on the back of our camera viewing screens, so we're used to that idea. Moving on here to leading lines, here is this great Henri Cartier-Bresson photograph looking down this staircase. And first of all, take a look at how he's used that rule of thirds concept, where the bicyclist is and where the horizontal and vertical lines are, pretty effectively using that basic concept. But the other part is the leading lines, the leading line of the staircase and the leading line of the railing for the staircase, and how effectively that sort of points our eye down at what it is that Bresson is interested in having us look at. Another example of this is this great Edward Weston still life of a cabbage leaf, and how the visual effect of the lines of the cabbage leaf leading our eye from the foreground of the image up and over the cabbage leaf. It's a very dynamic image, given that it's an image of a still cabbage leaf. So it's the visual effect of those leading lines and the repetition in this case of those leading lines that really sort of push us back across the image and from the front of the image to the back of the image. Here's another great example of leading lines. Ansel Adams here with this terrific photograph that does a couple of things. One is that it uses something that we'll talk about in a future episode of Camera Position, something called the near-far effect, which Adams was very, very fond of. And it also gives a wonderful sense of what the photograph is about, even though the subject, at least in my mind, the subject of the photograph is not really occupying an enormous amount of the frame. So here we have the nearby view of these roots in the foreground. And here Adams is giving us a sort of a place to stand, but also giving us a visual set of cues as to what it is that we're supposed to look at. So those roots in the foreground are pointing us across the water, emphasized then by that reflection or the reflections of the trees in the water, and pointing us back to what I consider to be one of the primary subjects of the photograph, this beautiful luminous rock that is in the background, top right corner of the photograph. And so here Adams is really kind of pointing at what it is that the photograph is all about, and he's pointing at it in a number of ways, with the roots, with the reflections of the trees, and with what he does not show us. So what it is that we don't see on the opposite bank of this body of water is just as important as what we see in the foreground and middle ground of this photograph. Another one of those compositional rules was balance. Balance. And here is Philip Traeger using balance really effectively in this photograph, a photograph of a very symmetrical building with an equal number of windows on the left side of the door and on the right side of the door, and Traeger has stood precisely on the little walkway that leads up to the building. And he's also noted that there are two equal trees that are balancing out the photograph. So it's very symmetrical. The weight on the left side of the photograph is equal to the weight on the right side of the photograph. And we can really see that occurring here as we look at the picture, that it really, if we were to put a fulcrum right in the center of the picture, it would balance out perfectly. In contrast to that, here is this Arnold Newman photograph of Igor Stravinsky, the great composer and piano player, pianist. And here is Stravinsky. First of all, remember that Newman, as a photographer, a portraitist, liked to use the environment of the subject to give a sense of who that subject was, so that we had some sense of who he was, what they were doing, what that person was all about. And so certainly Newman has used the piano to kind of tell us that Stravinsky is a musician, and that's important. Now, also, he's used the shape of the piano's lid both to tell us that it's a piano, but also take a look at how much like a musical note that begins to look. And certainly Newman is really cognizant of that fact and really using that as part of what it is that he's doing in his composition. But if we look at this picture in terms of balance, boy, is there a lot more weight on the right side of the photograph than there is on the left. And so what Newman has done is he's balanced out this huge void of black of the lid of the piano with what we're primarily interested in, Stravinsky's face. And he's used that face and the sort of laconic expression that Newman has captured on Stravinsky's face. He's using that as asymmetrical balance. So here we have really, 90% of the photograph, more than that, maybe 95% of the photograph devoted to things that are not its subject. And yet it does not look like an out of balance photograph. So he's used asymmetrical balance. Also take a look, as you look at this photograph, at all of the wonderful triangles that Newman has created within this photograph. The triangle of Stravinsky and his arm and his head and the way in which he's sort of propping himself up. The triangle of the piano's prop stick, which not coincidentally points down to Stravinsky, but the piano's prop stick and the piano's lid forming another triangle. And then how he's used a sort of split value background, probably two different walls, one reflecting a little bit more light than the other. And that split background forming a number of other triangles in the background of the photograph. So it's a picture that not only uses asymmetrical balance, but it also uses triangles. And triangles are a fairly interesting subject, an interesting shape for us to look at. If we go on to taking a look at framing, here is Paul Strand's White Fence, really a wonderful photograph in and of itself, but look at how he has used the foreground element of the fence to contrast against the background elements of the barn and the building behind. There's a lot of other stuff going on in this photograph compositionally as well. The repetition of the little shapes of squares on the fence and the X's in the barn and the repetition of the windows and all of the other rectangles that are going on in the photograph, and how that really effectively leads our eye from place to place and allows us to make references from one thing to another. But what I'm aiming at here in this example is to use Strand's White Fence as an example of framing and how he has used the fence to give a sense of depth to the picture, so that we are in the foreground and the rest of the subject is in the background. If we move on to Eugene Atget's picture of Paris, you can see that he's used framing as well to show us what is underneath the bridge and to look into the distance beyond and to give us the sense of depth in the photograph. This is a photograph that exists in tremendous depth because we have been given something both in the foreground and in the background to look at, but we have been given a foreground that effectively sets up a picture within a picture for us to look at the image on the lower right corner of the picture as one image altogether, and to look at it in combination with the image, the elements of the image in the left-hand side and the top side of the picture. So a pretty effective use of framing. And again, some of you have listened to me talk about Eugene Atget before in camera position. When we've talked about his positioning of the camera, you know that he is one of my desert island photographers, a guy I would take along with me, books or images of his to visually sustain me if I were stranded on that desert island. So mergers. Now, mergers are one of those sort of typical beginning photographer mistakes, right? We often see beginning photographers inadvertently making these images where somehow by accident we wind up with a background element that conflicts with the foreground element. So here we have a stop sign growing out of a little kid's head, or the tree growing out of this lady's head. That's sort of the common issue one, right? That we don't see in two dimensions like the camera does. And as soon as we begin to move that camera image into a two-dimensional space when we make a photograph and make a print of that photograph, we begin to see the world in two dimensions. And while standing in front of both of these subjects, we'd know that the tree wasn't growing out of the lady's head, and we'd know that the stop sign wasn't growing out of the little boy's head, but reducing it to a two-dimensional image, we somehow begin to get that impression. Well, obviously, avoiding this is simply a matter of moving the camera or moving the subject or some combination of both. Imagine in both of these photographs if the photographer had stood just a few steps to the left or a few steps to the right, and how important that would be in terms of separating that subject from its background. And all that was really needed in both cases was just a slight movement of the camera. So mergers are generally referred to for beginning photographers as something to avoid, but I also like the implication of what can be done with mergers as we use them effectively in photographs. So here's this wonderful photograph by Edward Weston of Point Lobos, contrasting this beautifully smooth rock against the rough rock in the background. And take a look at what Weston has done by making this sort of intersection, this merger of the light value of the top of the rock with the dark value behind it. And think about how this photograph would be different if Weston had changed his camera position up or down just a little bit so that we had the white rock in the foreground contrasting against, well, the sand that's pretty much the same value. It would not have the same impact. I've drawn a little red box around it so you can see. I'll take that red box away so that you can see what the photograph really looks like. And imagine as the photographer, the choice that you have to make about how you put values, or in some cases colors, against one another. So here we have this just absolutely beautiful photograph that really is enhanced by the merger of foreground and background material. Another example that I'll use here is this wonderful photograph by Arno Raphael Minkinen. Minkinen is just a fascinating photographer, a really nice guy, and just interesting because what he's been doing is making photographs of himself. And here is a photograph where he's made this sort of body self-portrait that looks, for all the world, as though he has photoshopped in a sort of oddball set of limbs that don't seem to fit together, when in fact all he's really done is limited the camera's field of view so that we only see a certain part of his body. If we were to sort of zoom back a little bit, you could see where his fist is and where his thigh is, and it certainly helps to know, I think, that Minkinen is a very tall, very slender guy. So here he is really just making this unbelievably interesting merger of his arm and his legs in a way that makes us believe that something's amiss. And in fact, all he's really done is taken advantage of what he does and does not show us, and how he merges those two things together. So if we move on to getting close, some of you who have listened to Camera Position for a long time know that I really love this particular photograph, Two Leaves, or Brewster, New York, by Paul Caponegro. And I love the photograph for a number of reasons. One is the fact that Caponegro just got really close to his subject. He got very close to the leaf, in fact, so close that the foreground element of the leaf begins to slightly drift out of focus. And because our eye tends to travel to the lighter objects in the frame, he's sort of done a push me pull you here with the light leaf in the background and the darker leaf in the foreground. And the idea that really the foreground part should be projecting backward in terms of its value, its lightness or darkness, but in fact it does not, partly because of where he's positioned the camera and how close he's gotten, and how getting close like that really simplifies the field of view. Another photographer who got close here is Robert Maplethorpe, and Maplethorpe has done a couple of really wonderfully interesting things. For one, what he's done is he has gotten in very close to this sculptural head and paid particular attention to the absolutely beautiful smoothness of this polished marble surface. And that in and of itself is interesting, but also look at what happens when Maplethorpe has changed the way in which we see the head by virtue of how he's placed the right-hand edge of the frame. By placing the right-hand edge of the frame just so, he's created something called a negative space, or a negative shape. Positive space and negative space are compositional terms that we use pretty frequently to describe what happens when we draw a frame or a boundary around something. So in this case, what Maplethorpe has done is he's created positive space with the sculptural head and negative space by the absence of that head. The shape of the black space here really effectively works to enhance our sense of the edge of that profile of this sculptural head. Just a beautiful photograph, and another one of my favorite photographers, just because of how widely varied his body of work was, and really just always looking at things that he was just absolutely fascinated with. And another sort of thematic idea in camera position is photograph what you know and photograph what you love, right? So if we kind of go back a little bit to look at just a few great compositions, here's one that I've profiled in an earlier episode of Camera Position, and I couldn't resist putting it in here again, Eugene Atget's St. Cloud, and how effectively Atget places his camera to create leading lines within the photograph, to work effectively with that rule of thirds concept and how that works out in this image, and also take a look again at how his positioning of the camera left to right lines up objects in such a way to make some interesting triangles occur. Frederick Evans, the great 19th century photographer, here photographing in Wells Cathedral, this wonderful photograph of steps. A sea of steps was what Evans titled this photograph, the waves of these approaching steps. And we can see that the repetition of lines and also the sort of visual flow or the leading lines that those steps create to lead our eye up and up and up and into the back of the cathedral. So it's a combination of repetition and repetition of leading lines, and how those leading lines really move us through the image. Here's a great image, another one of my favorite photographs, generally avowed as one of the masterpieces of modern photography, Alfred Stieglitz's The Steerage from the early part of the 20th century. And I love this photograph for a bunch of reasons, but not the least of which is that it violates all of the basic rules of composition, right? All of those things that we've been talking about, the rule of thirds and the idea of leading lines and the flattening or depthening of space, and how we see the image. All of those things are sort of thrown out the window here. And in fact, what Stieglitz would talk about, if he were here to tell us, he would talk about the combination of the sort of sociological implications of the photograph, but also the structural implications of how references of oval shapes and X's and so forth resonate throughout the photograph. But I'm really fascinated by the fact that it's a picture that's built entirely around the edges of the frame. The center of the frame holds no particular interest, no particular visual information that works particularly well, and yet it's a beautiful and very effective photograph and moves our eye pretty effectively from place to place. Another photograph that I wanted to show you, again, Paul Caponegro, and look at how simple this photograph is. Just a few elements, rocks, water, sunlight, pretty much that's it. But take a look at what he's done in terms of composition. He's placed one of those rule of thirds lines where that little sparkle of water is. He has simplified the composition very effectively. He has used the sort of horizon line very effectively. He's limited our field of view. He's gotten close to some foreground objects to give us a sense of scale, a sense of depth to the image. Even though it's a kind of a flattened out image, he's really giving us some cues to how big and where we are and so forth and so on. And talk about simplification. Here's another one of my very favorite Paul Caponegro photographs, just an incredibly beautiful image that is so simple as to almost have no subject whatsoever. Here is a photograph of a pond with a few raindrops falling on it and some little bits of grass sticking up. But look at how much Caponegro has told us with a photograph that is this terribly, just unbelievably simple. A few little raindrops, some little blades of grass. He doesn't show us the opposite shore of the body of water, but we have a pretty good sense of how big it is because he hasn't shown us the opposite side. But what he has shown us is the reflection of trees or some other objects in the other side so that we know that it's not very far off. We know approximately where we're standing because while he has not shown us the near edge of the body of water, he's shown us these little blades of grass that give us an indication that it's quite shallow right near where we are. He's told us what kind of day it is by showing us those little pitty-pats of raindrops on the body of water. And if we look at it, it violates all of those rules of composition, right? There's no horizon line. There's no use of that rule of thirds. There are no leading lines. There's no sense of balance. None of those things really apply, and yet it's a very effective photograph. Another Henri Cartier-Bresson photograph that effectively uses these some of these ideas, framing certainly the picture within a picture of the guy, sort of looking out of that little aperture, and certainly another frame that sort of frames up this kid that's in the background of the image. The rule of thirds for the placement of horizontal and vertical elements in the frame, and really just a wonderful graphical sense to this photograph by Cartier-Bresson. Wright Morris, one of my favorite photographers and an amazingly gifted writer as well. So here's Wright Morris getting up close to his subject, getting very, very close to what it is that he wants us to look at so that we can contemplate the details of these objects. But also look at how he's used not only that closeness and simplification, but he's also used a kind of leading line with that diagonal of the toothless comb to kind of draw us from the top right down to the lower left so that we pay attention to these little objects in the ashtray that he's looking at. So the rules of composition, learning the rules and then forgetting about those rules, because really ultimately what we want is to kind of have a sense of the rules of composition, but also to have a sense of those rules being able to be broken so that we don't always slavishly devote ourselves to the rules that we want, that we're supposed to look at as a photographer. So a couple of bits and pieces of business here at the end of this episode of Camera Position. One is that I wanted to thank all of you who have written to me. I don't always get back to everybody right away. I try to get back to you eventually, but it might sometimes take a while due to the volume of mail that I get. But feel free to write with comments, jeff@jeffcurto.com or jeff@cameraposition.com. Either one works. And I'm always interested in hearing from you, and thanks for those of you who have written in. Thanks, too, for those of you who have left comments on the iTunes store about Camera Position. I really appreciate them, whether they're positive or negative. It's always great to hear from people, and it appears as though the iTunes folks take great stock in those as well. So it really depends on how many comments I have and how many people are downloading Camera Position in terms of where it is that Camera Position appears in the sort of hierarchy of things. And the more listeners we have, the happier we are, and the more people we have making comments on the cameraposition.com blog pages. That's also great. So feel free to leave some comments there as well. But if you have a few minutes and you're there in the iTunes store, I would love it if you'd go and drop a comment in the Camera Position iTunes store area and just let people know what it is that you think about Camera Position so that they have some better ideas of how to judge what Camera Position is doing for you. So also, I wanted to mention one of our listeners, Ron Diorio, has an exhibition of his work in New York City at the Peter Hay Halpert Fine Art Gallery. And the exhibition opened on January 10th of 2008, and it runs the 10th of January through the 23rd of February. The Peter Hay Halpert Fine Art Gallery is at 511 West 25th Street, Gallery 306 in New York. And I'll put a little link here to both Ron Diorio's website as well as the gallery. And I really like Ron's work, and I would agree with Bill Hunt, who wrote in 2005 that, quote, "The abstracted, dreamlike nature of Ron Diorio's stylish studies is subdued and engaging. This is work that lingers in my memory." And so if you're in New York City, take some time and go drop by the gallery and take a look at Ron Diorio's work, because I think you'll get some stuff out of it. I think it's a terrific body of work, and I wish I were in New York City. I'd go look at it myself. So thank you very much for being here and taking a listen to Camera Position, and look forward to seeing you next time on the next episode of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography. Camera Position is a proud member of the Photocast Network, your photo resource in the potosphere. photocastnetwork.com